Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everybody. Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. And we have a full house today. Kevin Gordon, co-host of the show, President of Capital Advisors. Always here, Kevin, glad to see you.
Great to be back with everybody.
And frequent and favorite guest of ours, former Governor Bob Wise, served in Congress for many years, actually on the Infrastructure Committee. So little teaser about what we'll be talking about. Also helped form an organization called Future Ready, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Governor Wise, glad you're here.
Good to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, and we also are very lucky to have Blake Heller. He's one of our digital advisors consultants, an expert in the field of data and student data, actually finishing up his doctorate at a school you've probably heard of called Harvard. And Blake, thanks for being here today.
It's great to see you all. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so just a quick little plug. We saw the two stimulus in a row had 20% of the dollars aimed at solving learning loss, mitigating learning loss, learning recovery, you name it. There's several, terms for the same thing. We are going to do a top tech consideration and data consideration for mitigating learning loss, and that's going to be on April 29th at 11 a.m. So Blake will be there. I think Kevin might pop in and help us with some of that as well, and that'll be April 29th at 11. So please mark your calendars. We'll look forward to seeing you there. And Governor Wise, let's start in DC with infrastructure bill we've been hearing a lot about in the news. Can you tell us, what are the aspects of that impact education that you see so far?
So, following the passage of the most recent $2 trillion stimulus package, President Biden and his administration are now putting forward essentially a $2 trillion infrastructure bill that covers has traditional infrastructure and then adopts some unique definitions of infrastructure. But in terms of education, let me quickly run through the details. $100 billion of that would go to school construction and modernization. And what that would mean, though, is that would be equally divided. 50 billion, that's with a B, 50 billion would be in direct grants, probably based on degrees of Title I, and the other 50 billion would go to leverage bonds so that you could use that money to help in your borrowing. So 100 billion for school construction and modernization with an emphasis on health and safety upgrades and energy efficiency and innovative schools with technology. Just to point out that over most of our school buildings today are over 50 years old. So this comes at a critical time. Second major item, $100 billion to improve broadband access. This comes on top of what has already been approved, the $7.2 billion that goes to the Federal Communications Commission to improve E-rate. And I think very significant, of which schools will get a portion of this, is $45 billion in there to replace lead pipes. The Flint, Michigan tragedy and others very uppermost. And so, but school buildings would definitely be affected by that. The president referenced it. All of this would be over 8 years. And so that funding, and then in terms of how much does California get, I always defer to Kevin on this, but we've agreed that usually California gets somewhere between 10 and 13% of any federal dollar that's allocated. So you're looking at somewhere around 12 to 13 billion dollars just for the $100 billion school construction, and also for the $100 billion broadband as well. So a lot of other measures in there. Let's also just remember, Congress and the last two administrations have been talking about a massive infrastructure bill. There are other provisions in there, massive amounts of funding for highways, roads, bridges, water systems, other high-tech initiatives, also job training, but this is the education component.
Thanks so much, Bob. And Kevin, when we were prepping for this, you were mentioning you had some interesting points about this construction piece in particular. Could you share that with us, please?
Yeah, I mean, just really, and Bob and I were kind of comparing notes on it, is that I don't think at any time in my career have I seen the federal government. And in fact, I think our Republican friends are going to argue this, that it's not a traditional role for the federal government to be involved with giving direct dollar funding to school districts for new construction and modernization. They haven't done that in the past. But they actually have done, and I remember this during the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration, in fact, it was done through the US Treasury Department, which is they assisted districts in buying down the interest rate on bonds. So that's back sort of in, again, half of the package would be focused on help with bonds, but that construction money is just really fantastic. And, it'll play out here in terms of the politics that I think, Governor, you'll talk a little bit about, but if they can get this done, because of course they've got seemingly the ability in both houses and the White House to all be in agreement on this, it'll be a big precedent setter for federal government to get involved with these issues. And if you think about in California, where we were unable to pass our state bond last November, that there's legislation that's still moving right now to put a bond on the 2022 ballot. And I think that's going to be successful. But every bit helps with regard to the modernization and new construction lift that we have. And as Bob said, we'll get a healthy share of that money.
Thanks. And Governor Wise, yeah, Kevin alluded to it, but can you walk us through some of the politics back in DC when the headline came out? It looked like it was a done deal, but there's been a lot of back and forth in DC. Can you share that with us, please?
Well, there's a reason major infrastructure bills that have been proposed by President Trump, President Obama, that I can recall, probably President George W. Bush. There's a reason that they haven't been able to get enacted, and one is because there's partisan differences about how you raise the money. President Biden proposes increasing the corporate tax rate and other what they call closing tax loopholes. The Republicans are saying most Republicans at least are saying that's not acceptable. Others are saying, wait a minute, you're not going to jam. Are you going to try and jam this through like you pushed the American Rescue Plan a month or so ago? So there's a lot of back and forth. But the politics are that you're going to have to. The politics are partisan right now in terms of how you pay for it and whether or not how much are you willing to have the federal government incur this debt. The timeline on it, though, let me just jump to that, is Speaker Pelosi has said that that she would like to see it she'd like to see at least out of all the committees, and I want to get to that in just a second, out of all the committees by July, and then by August having it out of the House and into the Senate. In the Senate, it gets naughtier because even Senator Manchin, Democratic Senator Manchin of West Virginia, has said that he thinks Republicans need to be included in this before he's prepared to vote for a bill with just Democratic votes. Let me just make a note. I served 18 years on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House of Representatives. This bill will also be somewhat delayed because it's complicated and it doesn't go through just one committee. The portions dealing with roads go through the Transportation Committee. A lot of this will go through the Education and Labor Committee, and incidentally, Chairman Bobby Scott of the Education and Labor Committee, or the House Education Committee, has already introduced a bill similar to this prior to this bill being introduced. So you have to meld that. The broadband pieces will go through the Energy and Commerce Committee. How you pay for it, the tax increases go through the Ways and Means Committee. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to be done. So I don't look to see this, if it gets enacted, I don't look to see it done it'll be difficult to get it done by the end of the year.
And when you say end of the year, Bob, you mean the end of the calendar year?
I'm trying to hedge because I've always been so wrong before on this, Kevin. Thank you for pulling me out with specificity. Yes, I'm saying the calendar year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
The one thing I'll change it is if in the Senate it is clear that the Republicans aren't going to come to the table at all, and what Speaker Pelosi is doing, she's giving, while the House takes it up first, and this is the usual pattern, House takes it up first, she's giving the Senate time to try and get its act together to negotiate to see whether it can happen. If it's been proven that there can't be any discussions, then perhaps the Democrats are willing to jam it forward. One other note, if you recall, the reason the stimulus package passed in a month or so ago was because Democrats used something fairly arcane called reconciliation. They avoided a filibuster. They are now, I thought you could only do that once a year. They've just gotten a ruling that you can actually come back and play that card again in the same year. So they may try that as well. But they will most likely wait until the fall and try to do negotiations during the summer. That's why I'm predicting we will be fortunate to see it by the end of the calendar year.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting about the politics is that what we found under the prior administration and when Republicans had the U.S. Senate, um, one of the sort of the watch phrases in D.C. was "quote unquote" because we can. Whether it was a Supreme Court nomination or any of these things, they did things because they could. They didn't really care much about bipartisanship, and we got a lot of things that happened that a lot of people scratched their head about in terms of a pretty one-sided approach to decision making. So the Democrats take over, and I see that while it's absolutely clear that the public across the country would love to see more bipartisanship, that it's puzzling to me why the Democrats don't really assert even more so that same principle of because we can. We're going to pursue our agenda because we can do it, and I don't think the American public would really. While they do like bipartisanship, I think doing it earlier than later is better because they are going to face midterm elections.
Yep.
And just getting the thing done so that they can put points on the board for their own base would seemingly be a smart thing politically. But it'll be interesting to see. And I think the effort to try to at least work with the other side if they can is a good thing. But at the end of the day, I think the longer they wait into the year to get this thing that, Biden's kicking off now, I think it starts getting weighed down by the burdens of the politics of the proposed tax increases and some of those other things. So hopefully they'll get this thing done sooner than later.
You're absolutely correct. And I think where the Obama administration ran into problems early on, particularly with their healthcare initiative, was they waited and waited and waited in the Senate. I would note that I think the Democrats would like to do because we can, but unfortunately it's because we can light, because with just 50 votes in the Senate out of 100, one senator or two that don't want to go along or say too much spending or something like that, and you're not able to jam it through. And also you're still dealing with the filibuster, and we've got we've got one, and I think several Democratic senators saying they won't touch that. So it's because we can, but we're going to have to really work at it.
Yeah. Okay.
Looks like we're in for another wait and see moment here. Like we were waiting on that second stimulus package for quite a while, and it's great to get that insight from you, Bob. I'll just add, when you see the big number, the $100 billion for Internet for All, it is a noble goal, and of course we talk about it on the show all the time. I'm excited to see it, but don't think that that's going to provide any immediate relief to your school district. That's going to be a longer term solution. Running fiber to where it doesn't exist right now, that takes years. And as you mentioned, Bob, 8 years perhaps before we see all that money spent. There are other initiatives that we called out on the show before that will have a more immediate impact, but this one is going to be a while before you see it. So with that, Kevin, there was some news about unemployment insurance. It's a big deal this week. Can you fill us in on that, please?
Yeah, really an emerging issue for school districts all across the state. And superintendents are just getting briefed by their CBOs about this. That there is going to be an increase, and it's quite a increase to unemployment insurance for school districts across the state that they're sort of doing the calculations on. It's not totally clear yet whether or not this is sort of a spiking effect that is a bit temporary, or what of the increase would be something that's a sustained burden and ongoing. But it appears for sure that we've got an increase that will be coming next year that was unanticipated, that will cost districts a substantial amount of money. And as a result, we want to get this in front of budget writers at the state level as quickly as we can, so that maybe the governor gives some consideration in the May revision to some relief for school districts, at least for next year. So major issue, we're on it. You're going to hear a lot more detail about it as it unfolds. We're just getting some of the details, but I just wanted to make sure we put that out there.
Yeah, no, it's just another thing for folks to be worried about, right? That could be a big gotcha. So thank you for calling that out, Kevin. Also, big news this week, the governor wants to reopen the state, came out with some aggressive language on that this week. Can you tell us a little bit about that and then the implications for schools?
Yeah, as the governor announced a complete reopening of the economy by June 15th, the obvious question for us in the education community is what are the implications for statutory and other rules and regulations that they put into effect that impact public education? And it's not completely clear yet. The administration did not do the outreach, I think, to the K-12 community we would have liked to have seen before he made that announcement. But I think generally, the implications are not going to be really profound, in a negative way in terms of us having to readjust, and mostly because we knew that we had a rubric that said once you reopen, you stay open, regardless of what happens with regard to the tiered structure that now will go away. So as it goes away, that structure again for tiers for reopening and closing, depending on what was going on with case counts and a lot of other metrics, as that all gets swept away, the implications for us, because most school districts are obviously on a path to reopen under the provisions of AB 86 that was passed, there aren't going to be a lot of implications. But one of the things that are leftovers that we want to make sure that the administration hears is that there are some conflicts between what will now be sort of the preeminent guidance, which is the Cal-OSHA guidance, and the California Department of Public Health guidance. There's some actual conflicts in the language there that now need to be brought into sort of sync. One of them, and the most important thing in my view, is the issues regarding those that have vaccines. So we got to deal with the vaccine issue. Your guys are hearing the voices of children, which is always welcome on our show. But our producer Rachel Shakluna has her cute little one on the air. So pardon me for that.
It's actually it may be my daughter Ruby, so sorry.
Okay, no worries.
No, we're all working from home these days, and if you saw the Q thing we did on Saturday, I had a speaker just magically turn on right in the middle of our event. So this is just all part of our current reality. And speaking of that, thank you for sharing that, Kevin. And it's a good segue over to Blake and your daughter. So glad you're here. But Blake, wanted to talk to you. We've been hearing a lot about learning loss, mitigating learning loss, learning recovery, unfinished learning, so many different versions of it. And Kevin, you'll have to remind me what the new flavor is in California. It's with the
learning recovery, I think, is what we're talking about.
Gotcha. It was sort of the flavor of the week, but learning recovery is kind of what we're sticking with for the show. But Blake, if you're a school district leader and you actually have this 20% of this 2 stimulus packages standing in front of you, got a couple of years to spend it. When you think about data, particularly, how do you leverage data or actually reinvent your data to approach this? Where would you start?
Yeah, I think, regardless of what you're calling the challenge here, I think that when we think about how to get back on track after this disjointed year of remote or hybrid learning, there's kind of 2 broad buckets of questions that feel most pressing to me. One is, what do we do? It's an implementation, it's a pedagogy question. And the second is, how do we know where to intervene and how do we know if it's working? That's a measurement and a data question. And so when we think about this second bucket of questions, there's kind of 3 ideas I think that can guide our thinking. One is, I think the first thing we have to do before we do anything else is to get buy-in from the community, from students, from teachers, from parents. And that's going to involve, I think, reframing the data collection exercise as being more of an educational census, trying to establish that new baseline so we can figure out where we are, so we can figure out if what we're doing is working, so that from a district or state level, we can target resources equitably and make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck, and that communities that are in the most need are getting the resources that they need. And hopefully this is a perspective that sticks. So that kind of reframing and establishing a new baseline. The second thing is, just like we ask teachers to backwards plan their lessons, to have the learning goal in mind when they start an assessment or they start a lesson plan, we need to have backwards plan our data collection. Think about how we're going to be using the data we collect, because that's going to inform what you need and what's going to be the right data metrics to collect for the purposes you're going to use them for, which are going to be very different from a state or a district level, where you may be using it primarily for resource allocation, versus a school level, where you may be trying to diagnose individual groups of learners or individual learners themselves and try to help them catch up from a year of unfinished learning. And then the third principle I would keep in mind here is trying to go beyond assessment scores and test scores, and thinking about other forms of data, other ways of measuring kind of the health of our communities, whether it's social emotional learning, whether it's school environment surveys, mental and physical health, or even just benchmarks of kind of who's there and, chronic absenteeism, things like that. So kind of thinking outside the box in terms of what is valid data that can help us diagnose what's going on in our schools is a really important aspect.
Thank you, Blake. And Kevin, you had some interesting points on the evidence side of this and what people are being asked for there. Could you share that, please?
Yeah, and one of the things that you'll see is a common theme, and it really underscores the importance of the workshop, Tim, that you and Blake are going to be doing, which again, our LEAs are going to get a lot thrown at them on best practices and neat ideas for what you might do relative to expanded learning and intervention and learning loss and all these things from, as Blake talked about, at a pedagogical standpoint. But the one thing that's underscored, and it's in the state legislation, and it's also found in the federal legislation, is that they want districts to be implementing evidence-based programs, evidence-based approaches to dealing with these issues. Evidence-based means something, and that's exactly what, when we're going to tie it back to the data that says it works. That's really fundamentally what it's all about. And so when you participate in this webinar that ultimately we're going to end up doing, that's going to be the focus about that attention to data and what data tells us, and really charts the course for where you're going to be headed with an incredible amount of resources. We know there's going to be a lot of accountability on the back end of this to talk about what did we do with the money. And that underscored effort in statute, both at the state and federal level, on evidence-based practices is going to be important.
Just one other place I'd like to point out that it's underscored is an article that was just published, I believe, this week by the chair of the State Board of Education, Linda Darling Hammond, in Forbes magazine on remediation isn't sufficient for learning recovery. You have to be engaging in evidence-based practices and just exactly as Blake said. So at every level, this is going to be the message for district leaders and school leaders.
I saw that article yesterday, Bob, a great article that she did. And maybe we can do a link after, when you guys look up this program or you're done watching this, to that article. It's very, very worth reading.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. We'll add that at the bottom of the YouTube broadcast and also be emailing that out. So great call out, Kevin. And, actually, you bring up some good points, Kevin, when we were talking about evidence-based, and I'll just tie that back to what you said, Blake. You're talking about backwards mapping your data, right? Like what do you want to see, and working backwards about how you're going to collect it. And if you actually approach a project in this way, it's going to be a lot easier to provide that accountability, to provide that evidence that you're being asked for. So I thought that was wonderful. One of the trickier things in this space right now, when we got people working and learning from home or hybrid, is that social emotional piece. You mentioned it briefly, Blake, but that one seems like a really tricky thing to put data around. But can you just talk about some of the data aspects of that or challenges there that you see?
Yeah, I think some of the softer skills are harder things to measure. I think traditionally in education we have something of what in another field we call a street lamp problem, where we tend to look for evidence where the light is shining the brightest. And I think over time, and especially in this current moment, we're realizing that beyond math and reading scores, the social, emotional, the mental health of our students is paramount. And so there have been assessments that are being developed. There are organizations like Fuel Ed, Aperture, the core districts in California that are kind of piloting and pioneering kind of new measures of social emotional learning and school climate. And I think, again, to go back to your kind of backwards planning piece, this is one of those things where a year from now, we maybe have questions about kind of, the kind of the response to this year of, for some trauma, for some just, the lack of social interaction, and just all of the kind of differences and challenges that people are bringing into the classroom. And if we don't have a baseline data to refer to in terms of what did our schools look like in 2021, in 2022, we're going to have a hard time assessing whether or not things have gotten better or worse, where the gaps have emerged, where do we really need to improve, and where are our strengths. And that applies to the academic goals as well, right? What learning strategies or what skills we're best able to translate onto a hybrid or online platform that will help you kind of target where should we be intervening, where should we be investing resources in a world of constraints.
I think that's really important to keep in mind as well, Blake, because one of the things I think we often see with our clients is they're collecting so many points of data without that vision of where they're really trying to aim. So you have this moment in time to kind of reinvent that data infrastructure. We're definitely going to be digging into it on that webinar on the 29th, and hope you all join us, and please help us spread the word on that. Want to just say thanks everybody for being on, and Governor Wise, any final thoughts from you before we depart?
Just once again, it's a major piece of legislation going through a lot of different committees in both houses, and it's going to be a long time. But as I always close on this, is please keep stressing to your elected representatives now how important it is, and that helps light the fire under them. And sometimes, and Kevin, maybe one time, this could be the time we see something different happen. It could actually lead to some bipartisanship. But just keep the pressure on that, or the pressure too strong, perhaps. Let's just say keep the message on, and make sure that they understand. Invite them to your school, to your district, to see the situation with lead pipes, to see how old the building is, what needs to be done to bring it into the 21st century, and not just keep it in the 20th.
Well, excellent advice as always. And Blake and Kevin, Bob, I want to say thanks so much for being here. Great show this week, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody next week with some more news. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Guys, great to see you.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.